I really appreciate this opportunity to present this webinar, and I'm very excited to see 75 participants, many of which are our old friends and hopefully some new friends out there as well. So as Andrew said, I'm Sara Brown. Welcome. Before I dive in, I would like to do just a couple of things. The first is I want to acknowledge and support the brave women who recently came forward and shared their stories with the media. I think they represent a lot of women in our workforce history, and I am truly sorry, like I'm assuming many of you are, that they endured the pain and suffering that they did. But I'm also very thankful that they've provided a platform for dialogues like this one that we're starting here today, and I do hope that this is a starting point, that this webinar is just a beginning of lots of tough, open conversations that need to be had. Some of you may wonder if I experienced or faced similar harassment as the women in the documentary did, and I'd like to answer that here at the outset, and also as a possible explanation for some of what I'll share today. I have not experienced sexual assault, thankfully, or harassment like inappropriate touching. However, I have experienced many uncomfortable conversations and innuendos, awkward locations, and certainly subtle sexual discrimination, probably not unlike most women who have spent time on the Fireline. So what I plan to share today may explain sort of how I combated any further mistreatment. And I want to be absolutely clear that I'm not condoning what I will share. In many ways, I wanted to jump for joy when this CPS story came out, but I found that I wasn't really able to truly celebrate with those women who brought their issues forward, because deep down, I believe I was actually part of that problem. I contributed to subtle discrimination myself, and for years I wanted to take the time to reflect and understand why, from my perspective, an otherwise caring, open, diversity-seeking individual like myself have some of these dark moments in my past. It's really easy to say and think that I just got caught up in the system, but I believe it has deeper cultural roots than that. So with that little introductory blurb, I'm going to open my heart and let you in on something very uncomfortable. I've never had to give a disclaimer for a talk before, and I'm hoping that this actually does make many of you guys feel uncomfortable. So here's my formal disclaimer. The views I share in this presentation are not necessarily the views of the women in my pictures or any of the women that I reference directly or indirectly. And I will share a lot of my own personal photos, most of which, all except for two, are my actual photos from my past in fire. However, there's a little caveat to this. I have done some private research and found that at least several women who've shared my path also share some of these views. Like I said, this is not, a normal talk for me. It's a very personal topic. And so hopefully some of that discomfort will come through. I want to share a bit of my background with you in terms of my firefighting career so that you can understand sort of what my path has taken. Before I do that, I'll say that growing up, I would definitely be considered a tomboy, right? I liked playing outside, getting dirty. I prefer games like football or baseball over playing with dolls or dress up. And so when the opportunity arose in 1996 to be part of a trail crew through the YCC Youth Conservation Corps program in the Forest Service, I took it. And I really enjoyed that experience working for a summer. And at the end of the experience, I was given the opportunity to work in a local fire camp for about a month. And this was my first introduction to the world of fire. The next year, I was lucky enough to join the local Type 2 IA crew on the Willamette National Forest, where I stayed for 4 seasons. I worked my way up from, beginning firefighter to a squad boss on that crew. Like many folks, I worked my way through college using fire funds in the summer to fund part of that education. And when I graduated in 2001, I took a summer job with Zion Helitack in the Park Service on the Helitack crew there. The next year, I got it into my head that I wanted to be a smoke jumper, and I applied and was accepted at Boise. And I actually washed out of that training. And for those of you who know much about the smoke jumper program, you'll know that was a silly idea because I didn't have any hot shotting experience. So I took the chance failed and turned sort of those lemons into lemonade by getting a season under my belt on the Snake River Hot Shot crew. The next year I was successful at passing rookie training in Redmond, Oregon at the base there, and I enjoyed a long season with the Redmond Smoke Jumpers. The following year I transferred to West Yellowstone, where I stayed for 4 more seasons jumping. And for those on the line here who know me a little bit better, you'll know that I ended my operational career with a fairly terrible accident, a parachuting accident, which ended in an amputated right leg below the knee. I'm not going to be talking about that today, and so if there are questions about that, I'm sure we can handle that through offline conversation. So I want to just briefly talk about specifically why this is so uncomfortable. And this is not the only thing that I guess I wanted to preface the discomfort before I share a little narrative with you. So I spent from the age of 18 to 29 building a reputation in fire. And this reputation included being really tough and not emotional. And I was always striving to do the job as well as the men. And who decided that reputation? Well, my fellow firefighters did, almost all of whom were men. There were a few women who were striving for the same sorts of things I was, but on the whole, it was men. So in order to admit what I'm going to admit and say what I'm going to say here today, I have to be okay shattering that reputation to some degree. A prosthetic leg and 3 degrees and a job that I don't need to be a fast hiker or run a chainsaw well or tell hunting stories around the campfire later, I can fill you in on this little secret. And it's one that is still, given what I just said about reputation, very uncomfortable because it admits vulnerability, weakness, cruelty, and a major flaw in our system. So with that, here it is, the uncomfortable truth. You can read along with me if you want, or you can close your eyes and just listen to the story. It's my first season. I'm 18. I'm nervous. I have to keep up with men who outweigh me by 50 to 100 pounds and who grew up in the woods doing man things. You know, cutting firewood, hunting, fishing. Why am I doing this? I could be working at Dairy Queen or as a receptionist somewhere. Those jobs would be easier. But I decide I like a challenge. I'm fit, I enjoy being outdoors, and I'm curious about what it's like. I secretly want to do man things too. During the first few weeks of work, I figure out what's acceptable. I'm quiet. I watch. The guys talk about hunting trips and drinking beer. There's a theme to their stories, that they're tough and that they have survival skills. They can run chainsaws, fix trucks, get pumps going with tools they find in the old shed out back. I find that I can keep up with everyone on hikes, even though I carry my pack a little lower and I use my torso to lift things rather than just my biceps like the guys do. A few weeks into the job, a couple of guys start to ask me questions about myself. I think up answers that I assume they will like, given what I've heard them talk about. They seem to like my answers. Finally, our first fire assignment comes. My goal is to impress the men I'm working beside. I really need to impress them because I realize that they need to think I'm valuable. They need to care about me as one of their own. They need to want to look out for me because fires are actually dangerous. I need my coworkers to answer me when I call on the radio. During that first year in fire, I define who I am. I become a woman who has managed to fit in with the guys. I wear masculine clothes, no makeup. I put my long hair up and leave it up. I appear to be interested in masculine things. I start to value toughness the way they do. I hear myself tell stories that highlight how tough I am and how unemotional I am. Some of the stories feel foreign, but it's working. I'm fitting in. By the last day of the season, I've managed to successfully fit in. I get one-armed hugs goodbye and comments about, see you next year, stay in touch. Telephone numbers are exchanged, not in a boy-girl way, but in a guy who's just as good as a guy way. I'm proud. I'm a firefighter. It doesn't matter that I'm a woman. The guys have accepted me. Over the winter, I feel relief that I can be a more realistic version of myself. I let myself dress in a bit more feminine way. I talk with my girlfriends who I haven't seen all summer. I find that it's really nice to talk about girl things and show a bit more emotion. But I don't lose touch with the self I created for the fire season, though. I'll need that woman. Or is it more like a man come May? The next season, I show up at the fire base to a bunch of familiar faces. My fellow firefighters greet me, and we start reminiscing about the fire experiences from the previous summer. Instantly, I feel the old, more masculine self rise to the surface. It's a little bit uncomfortable, but I mastered the role. Then she walks in, another woman. She's wearing makeup and a tight top with a padded bra. My body instantly tenses. She walks directly over to me and introduces herself. I have worked so incredibly hard to construct a persona that fits in with this crew. I can see this girl shattering that persona, pulling me down into a female role that I fought so hard to shed. I know myself well. I'm prone to taking on the emotional labor of making sure everyone is welcome. If I'm overly nice to her, I'll end up taking care of her, being her friend, having to stick up for her when she can't hike as fast or when her hair is all dirty and she just can't take it anymore. And that, sticking up for another woman, would make me a woman. I shake her hand as hard as I can, say, I'm pleased to meet you, in a masculine sort of way, turn my back to her, and continue talking with my fellow male firefighters. I convince myself that I'm doing the right thing. I have to look out for myself. There's no way she'll cut it. We didn't become friends. If anything, I gave her the cold shoulder, more so than the guys did. In her defense, she made it 6 weeks. She was a fast runner and a good hiker, but in the end, she quit the crew. A personal family matter came up and she had to leave. I was safe to keep being a man in a woman's body, just hoping they didn't catch on. So I'd like to unpack a couple of uncomfortable points in that narrative. The first is this issue of creating a persona to fit in. In my case, fitting in with the firefighter culture was essential for safety and a positive work environment. Let's talk through that fake masculine persona that I created. If you think back to my brief history in fire, you know that I moved from crew to crew quite a bit, as I think most folks in fire do, especially early on in their career. And I found that every time I had to move crews, I found that I was reproving myself over and over in the same way. I would get to the new crew, figure out what the culture was, and then mold myself to that culture. And every single time I turned into that more masculine version of myself. And this meant that I didn't contribute very many positive characteristics that females typically possess. Things like the communication skills, providing alternative perspectives on risk-taking, sharing alternative ways to get things done, and providing emotional safety for my peers. I took some time and reflected on this and thought that I would look through the research to see if there was anything that sort of backed my experience, my feeling, or if it was just me that had created this fake persona. When I did that and I talked with other female firefighters, the ones that were openly willing to admit that, nearly all told me that they had done something similar. In fact, many men did too later as I started digging into this issue. When I looked to the research, I found this Drexel study by Jennifer Taylor. She's a PhD at Drexel's Dornsife School of Public Health, and she's looking at structure firefighters, which is different than wildland, but I believe some of the cultural issues are similar enough that we can compare the two groups. She was looking at women firefighters possibly improving the safety, and when she dug into it, she found that the culture in the department needed to change. She did her research by doing interviews and focus groups of female firefighters to see what unique safety behaviors women could possibly bring to the job and how those things might actually contribute to a safer fire service. In the end, she presents some cultural barriers that exist to being able to implement those things that women could potentially increase as far as safety. So as you look at my rookie class of 2003 here, I'm going to read you some of the quotes from this study. The first one says, women and men are socialized differently around risk. Men are told to embrace it. Women are told to avoid it. Therefore, it's possible that women would look at hazardous work by weighing the risks and benefits more than their male counterparts. A hyper-masculine environment limits all firefighters' ability to speak up, thus address safety concerns. When it comes to training, female fire service members recounted being put through girl drills, which amounted to extra or harder training that only women had to complete. That included anything from extra ladder carry drills to something as dangerous as practicing fire calls with oxygen packs being turned off. If you're not psychologically safe, you can't be physically safe. Sexual discrimination and hostile work environments will not help you retain a diverse workforce that looks at problems from multiple perspectives. So thinking about these quotes and this study, in my experience, I started to think about what I typically hear in the Forest Service, which is we have a very inclusive culture. And I actually disagree. I believe that, at least in fire, our culture is much more exclusive. And I think that exclusivity is killing diversity. So thinking about the definition defined here through simple definition by Wikipedia of inclusivity, it's pretty interesting the way that these groups are grouped. So here's the definition of inclusivity: an intention or policy of including people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized, such as those who are handicapped or learning disabled or racial and sexual minorities. Pretty interesting. So when I thought about that, I definitely agree that our culture of exclusivity is killing diversity. And here are some specifics to why I say that. We are losing diversity by having a culture that is so exclusive that you actually have to get into the culture, identify it, and conform to it. It's like there's some sort of secret handshake to get into the fire club. And firefighters, I would argue both men and women, must share that common culture. Right? They can't come in and bring in their own culture. They must fit in and conform to the culture that exists. And that overrides any external culture that would allow for diverse thought. It's nearly impossible to bring new, diverse, or heaven forbid, contradictory ideas up in a culture like that. And what happens is we basically only include versions of the same person. So we probably do have women, but they don't provide diversity because, in effect, they're the same as men. I talked with one of my colleagues, who I believe is listening in today, Kevin's sister, about this. And I shared this concept with him, and he said, you know, women are not the only ones who experience having to create a persona to fit in. He has seen in his career men struggling with this as well, right? Figuring out that they have to conform to this culture, and if they don't, they see the tough decision of leaving. He also brought up something else interesting, and that is the idea that the culture of fire definitely values experiential diversity. So it values people who have spent time on engines and helipack and on a hotshot crew, but it doesn't really value other types of diversity very much outside of that experiential type. So this has all been sort of Debbie Downer to this point, and I guess I'd like to change it up and talk about something a little bit more positive. Finally, I stayed on a crew long enough to where I did not feel I needed to prove myself anymore. This happened for me at West Yellowstone as a smoke jumper after 9 seasons of fighting fire in 2005. At that point, I was able to start letting a little bit of my real self, my more female self, leak out into my work. And this was a function of several things. It was a function of being really comfortable in a trusting culture. The people I worked with were not only colleagues, they were friends. I started to feel that I was safe. And mostly this came from within myself. I'd done the job long enough. I knew I could do the job. I knew others thought that I could do the job. And I felt that in any circumstance, which is false, I would be safe. I was maturing. I wasn't 18 any longer. I was 27 at this point. And I'd gotten really tired of having to prove myself. And I started to feel secure in the reputation that I'd built. There are benefits, tangible benefits of reaching this point of confidence. Because I believed that I gained respect from my colleagues, and I believed that they appreciated that I could do the job, I think they also started to appreciate that I could provide some of those female traits that were very few and far between in the world that I was working in, the smoke jumper world. Things like listening, emotional support, and a less judgmental person to share their weaknesses with. And I started to hear things and have conversations with people that I hadn't before. I started to hear, I'm tired. For those of you who know this community a little bit, you know that that's rare for somebody to admit openly that they're tired. For some reason, they were comfortable sharing this with me. My relationship isn't doing very well. I started to have really deep, more meaningful conversations when I was able to show my real self a little bit more. I heard I don't actually like this job from people that I would have assumed loved this job. One of my personal favorites is a fire ecologist. We shouldn't be putting fires out, right? People questioning the fundamental premise of the job that they've been doing for years. And I think this is unsafe. right? This is probably arguably the most important one. People being unsafe and having somebody comfortable to share that concern with. Again, when I talked with Kevin about this topic, he pointed out a couple of things that are very interesting and useful to point out here. Thinking about one of the challenges we have in this community with suicide and mental health issues, wouldn't it be important to have someone, if not just one, hopefully many, people that people can confide in, a comfortable person who provides things like listening and emotional support and a non-judgmental environment to share these things with, because these are really important conversations to be had. And I hadn't heard these before this point, when I reached a point of being able to be confident enough to let my true self shine through a bit. But this was not without challenges. I definitely have lost, still today, some of the female aspects of myself to fire. Right? I spent 11 seasons in this ingrained culture, and those seasons are not easily erased. Now, as a professional woman with 2 graduate degrees in a secondary fire position, I still question a lot of the same things that I did back then. I question, am I being tough enough? Should I work more? Am I being manly enough to lead this program? I find that I feel most comfortable around firefighters, and that judgment that goes with that has wide implications, as you can imagine. Perhaps the most disturbing to me is that I only deeply connect to women like me, who have been masculinized or understand the fire culture or some other similar culture where one would have to sort of masculinize themselves. And that's been really challenging for me in my personal life. So let's turn and talk about the other clearly uncomfortable thing that I pointed out in my initial narrative. Why would I turn my back on another woman in fire? Shouldn't minorities stick together as allies? And before I go down this path, I do want to point out that I was not universally down on women firefighters. I was selected based on a snap judgment. And you see here, the photo is an all-woman smoke jumper trail crew that was really fun, and deeply connected to many of these women. So it wasn't universally women. It was a certain type of woman. And this is the type of woman, a very dramatized version of the type of woman that I described in that narrative. Right? Of course she didn't look like this, but this is what I saw effectively in my mind when that woman came in with makeup and her tight top. I saw this. And another colleague helped me think through why this made me so uncomfortable, why I turned my back on this woman. And she asked me this question. She said, what does the ideal firefighter look like to you? And she and I agreed that to us, the ideal firefighter looks a lot like a hotshot Sawyer. Big, tall, strong, chainsaw-wielding person who can cut down giant hazardous trees carrying a 55-pound pack. So when you compare that to this person's not even close. But somehow, these women are closer to the ideal. Again, I turned to the research trying to understand this, because this has been nagging at me since I was 19 years old. And I read this article in The Atlantic by Olga Kossin, and she examines why women bully each other at work. She found that the conditions in the workplace might be to blame. Now, in this particular case, she is looking at lawyers and academics and businesswomen, but I think, again, like the structure fire women, much of the culture is transferable to wildland firefighting. So I'll just read these 3 quotes, and then I want us to tackle a couple of the theories that she provides in this article. So here are the author's interview quotes. There's hostility among the women who have made it. It's like, I had to give this up. You're going to have to give it up too. Women seem to cut down women. She'd rather work for men because she says they're more forthright. With women, I'm partly being judged on my abilities and partly being judged on whether or not I'm a friend or nice or fun. So one of the theories that's pointed out in this Atlantic article is the idea of tokenism. In the late 1980s, Robin Ely, then a graduate student in the Yale School of Management, found that women in male-dominated firms believed that only so many of them would make it into the senior ranks. So effectively, they were vying and competing with one another for those spots. The second theory is the queen bee theory. And a Dutch psychologist named Naomi Elmers was trying to understand the near total absence of senior women in academia. And as Xander pointed out, this is a little ironic because this was the job that I held right before taking this job that I'm in currently. In this study, women made up only 4% of full professors. Senior women coped with gender discrimination by emphasizing how different they were from other women. And she termed these women queen bees. So Elmers and Dirks tried to pinpoint the conditions in which queen bees emerge. I think these are really interesting and relevant to what I shared in that initial narrative. She found, or they found, that this happens when women are a marginalized group in the workplace, that they have made big sacrifices for their career, or that they're predisposed to show little gender identification or camaraderie with other women. So when a woman believes that the path to success is so narrow she can barely squeeze through herself, often she can't bring others along with her or doesn't believe she can. So women like this learn the hard way that the way to succeed in the workplace is to make sure that people realize they're not like other women. So I want to take this back to my experience. I think both of these theories lend explanation for my behavior, although, again, I don't condone this behavior. As far as tokenism goes, few women have been selected to be on crews in my experience, right? There's just a few. And that does leave us to vie for one another for spots, for moving up, for location within the crew. And I've talked with some hiring officials, and they say, you know, that's not really the case. There's this small pool of women out there to be hired. And so I don't know what you guys are complaining about. But in my experience, on nearly all of my crews, women were spread out, right, such that there were just one female per squad. And while I would like to believe that this is not the case, I will share with you my two actual assumptions that I assumed explained why women are spread out in this way. So the first assumption is that women are weak, and we can only tolerate one weak link per squad. The second assumption is that if there are two women, they will fight. Right? I would like to believe that neither of those are true. In talking with my a male colleague, he actually pointed out that when you have a strong woman on a crew, the guys tend to work harder, right? She continues working hard. When they're tired, they see that strong woman working hard. They don't want to be shamed by working less hard. So it's pretty interesting, A, that these were my assumptions, and B, that male colleague had experienced that occurrence, having a strong woman actually boosting production. Thinking about the other theory, the queen bee theory, I really did need my crew members to view me as unlike the other woman, right? I wanted them to think I was unique and I wasn't just a regular woman. And when that regular woman joined the crew, I didn't want the men to compare us, for them to find out that we were similar enough that her slightly more feminine character would ruin that distance I'd created from being a regular woman. She was definitely a threat to me. I don't believe this is just a woman problem. Right? I've spoken with several men, all of which have passed that magic threshold and no longer need to prove themselves, right? So they're well established, have a solid reputation in the fire community. And when I talk with these men, they actually say they wish that there were more women firefighters. And for them, I have some questions. I wonder if they want a woman who has sort of mastered that masculine persona. Or do they want a woman like the woman I turned my back on, right? The more feminine woman. I don't actually know what she would be like 9 seasons into her fire career because we don't have very many of her, if any. Or do these men want a woman who proved herself, stuck around long enough to be comfortable sharing what few feminine traits are left? And I would say we don't have a whole lot of these type of women either. So what do we do with all of these uncomfortable issues? I've had many conversations about whether or not there's this tipping point of women numbers that could be, a point at which tokenism or queen bee syndrome or anything like that would disappear. And in order to answer that, which I don't have an answer for it, I'd like to explore this idea of incentives. So if you look at the incentives and what we currently incentivize in the fire system, I would argue that we incentivize my ideal firefighter, right? The hotshot square. if the goal is to put out all fires, suppress fires, you need physical traits that can do that can, in theory, control an increasingly uncontrollable natural force, right? So if we want to continue going down the path we do, it makes sense that we incentivize people looking as close as possible to this guy here on the screen. But if we want more diversity, in particular women, we're going to have to think about how to encourage them through incentivizing. And some of the things that we may change or may want to argue should be incentivized might be things like the mental prowess to think through how to use fire, right? Things like we've already talked about, good communication skills, emotional intelligence, leadership skills, and many other things that I'm sure everybody on this webinar can think about. So if we agree that the current system needs to change and we think that women could potentially help that change happen faster, we're in a tough spot, right? It's sort of the chicken and the egg. We want the system to change and women could help it, but we don't have many women who are able to help that. I would argue that right now we have women sort of doing fire, getting into fire on their own with some mentorship probably. Once they're already in fire and they're establishing themselves, they meet other women who have also made it on their own, and they tend to accept them, right? However, they're really skeptical of helping the others who didn't make it on their own. This, of course, is not universal. Again, this is my personal experience. And so we face this challenge, right? How would we get those who made it on their own to mentor others who need a bit more help? So with that, I would like to throw out a question for our discussion. Maybe some folks would be interested in sharing their answers on this. My question is, would you support your daughter, wife, cousin, or female friend to become a wildland firefighter in today's fire world? Why or why not? And that's something our office has thought about a lot lately, and we've asked ourselves all this question. And so with that, I hope that we have a little bit of time left to have some pretty interesting discussion Q&A session. And I want to thank all of you for spending the time with me. I really appreciate it and look forward to answering questions as best I can. So thanks so much. I guess I'll hand it back over to Xander.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was an excellent presentation, and I really appreciate you being willing to kind of open up your personal story. It's very powerful, and I think it helps me as someone who only has dipped a toe in the fire world understand things a lot better. Let's see. We don't have questions in the chat window yet. Let's see. A lot of good stuff coming in, though. Let's see. So I'll try. Usually we don't have as many people on our phone line, so we can open up the whole phone line. But I think with 80 people, we'll probably try to do this via text. So I will attempt to read some of these comments, and as the questions come in, we can address them. So Miriam congratulates you on an excellent presentation. Heather says, definitely. I'm doing it almost every day. It's called recruiting, which is how I met Sarah. So I think that's one piece of the discussion is recruiting and actively engaging folks who could work in the fire world. And we maybe will return to this, but I'm interested to note, Sarah, that you mentioned the YCC program here in the Southwest. We're working on hiring youth for a YCC program on a couple of forests locally. And I think there's probably some thinking, and maybe Heather can add to this, about how for a wide spectrum of people, particularly women and other folks who are not well represented in natural resources, how we can encourage them to join that first crew, because maybe that's part of the secret. Bree says, thanks for a great job. Melanie, let's see, says, absolutely, it has been an incredible experience for me as a woman to find the confidence in myself that I would not have found elsewhere. So thank you for that, Melanie. Blanca says, thank you. Jen Hayes says, thank you for sharing, Sarah. Amanda Mahaffey has a question. Do you think what is needed to happen for the firefighting world or in other spheres is reaching a tipping point where women are accepted? Let's see, maybe I read that wrong. I'm sorry. What do you think is needed to happen in the firefighting world or other spheres to reach that tipping point where women are accepted as part of the team? So maybe, Sara, I think you've talked a little bit about that, but do you want to expand on your thoughts on how we get to that tipping point?
Yeah, and isn't that the challenge? So thank you for the question. I think there are multiple ways to go about this, but I do think that incentives are one way, right? In order to incentivize women to stay, something about our system needs to change. And so if we're staying with our current model, which not 100% universally is default just fire suppression, putting out the fire, I think we're going to be continuing to incentivize that, hotshot crew, the hotshot Sawyer that I talked about. But if we start to change the way we look at fire on the landscape, which I'm hoping that we are, and I know the consortium is one place that is promoting some of these dialogues at least. If we start to change our relationship with fire, I think that is one of the places that women could contribute more and more, right? If our default isn't hurry, put out this uncontrollable force, and it is more about thinking through and, spending time on the landscape, that women have a lot of strength in that area. And if we follow along and are able to incentivize that, I think that's one of the ways that we will be able to encourage more women to get into fire as a long-term career. I guess that's what I would say.
Great, thank you. I'll keep reading. There's some other good comments, sort of sifting through for points of discussion. There's one here, I want to see more women in fire and I'm working on it. A culture shift needs to occur. I like the perspective on which kind of front a woman needs to present. So I think that's the sort of support for some of the words you shared. Barb, let's see, a couple people have asked if the presentation will be shared, and we should, if all the technology works, we should have a recording, a video of the whole thing, and that will be shared with participants and also available on Frames, sort of as an archive, and it'll be available via the Southwest Consortium webpage. So try to share it out there. So Barb asks, says, I've heard suggestions that making crews half male, half female, some of the major issues would disappear on their own, but there's not enough data. So I guess maybe I'll add my question to that and then give you a chance to respond, Sara. Do you think that any of those, you highlighted this issue of sort of having women spread out as one person per crew was a fairly common. Is that changing at all? And I wonder if that would be a particular, maybe obviously there would be fewer crews with women, but maybe some crews would have reached that tipping point and be able to push change.
Yeah, these are good questions. I can't answer because I've been out of fire since 2007, whether the numbers are changing. I know there has been some research done, certainly at local unit levels, to see if the numbers of women in fire have increased or decreased. So I can't exactly address that with confidence, so I'm not even going to try. I do have strong feelings about Barb's question about making crews half male, half female. I guess my view on that is this would be dangerous territory. I think we have tried this in our past, and without some sort of cultural shift, like I talked about, happening, I think we would be in dangerous waters. For example, at an undisclosed smoke jumper base, there was once a push to have an all-female rookie class. And they were able to find women. They put them through the training, and the rookie training, as my understanding, went really well, right? There were women sort of competing with women to prove themselves in that rookie training. But when they were put out into the larger jumper community of 450, mostly male, they struggled because they came from an all-women's class. There was a perception that that was the weak class. Whether or not that's reality, I actually doubt it was, but that was a perception. And so crews that would be forced, and maybe that's not what Barb's suggesting, but crews that would be, if there was a policy put in place to have half female, I think would face a similar struggle in trying to, prove that they're as good as what typically has been an all-male crew. So I would argue that unless it happened naturally through a cultural shift and, there are incentives and reasons why those women are the best people for that position, there would be ongoing challenges and those women would face a tough road.
Yeah, I think, interesting point. Let's see. So many good comments here. I lost track a little bit. Emily Wolf writes in, I guess she's a writer working on a story about inclusion and diversity initiative in the BLM firefighting recruitment process. And she's looking for more specific perspectives on the positive values that women bring to the Fireline. So I think, Sara, you touched on a couple, and I don't know if you have others to add, but this would be a good spot.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's 2018 and we don't have a list of those things, right? I think we could probably all easily list the benefits of having that hotshot Sawyer on a crew, right? It's interesting that we haven't taken the time to physically list these benefits. And I'm not sure that it's talked about at least a professional agency level. I've listed some of them, so good communication, alternative ways of doing things, right? For me, I did have to, and some of it was subconsciously, figure out ways to move heavy objects. And the ways that I figured out how to do them were different than the guys were, but I would say mostly equally effective. So just doing different things, providing that emotional support, providing a diversity of abilities to communicate, I think is another one. I do think there are differences, and I'm sure that there's research out there. I just am not the person with the research on the tip of my tongue in terms of leadership, women's leadership capabilities. I know Rachel Reimer has done some work in that area. Assuming there is no cultural shift, I hope that's not the case, but assuming that's the case, the idea that women do provide, incentives for continuing production when you're really, really tired, like my male colleague suggested, right? Having a strong woman on the crew tends to keep all those guys working. Not that I totally promote that, but isn't it interesting? And I think it would be very interesting to do a survey of the things that firefighters see as benefits coming from women. So thank you for the question. I'm not sure if that answers. Nothing super new there, but it's very interesting. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, thank you. And I think actually some other folks, Eric Brown writes in that he works for the Nature Conservancy in the Southeast, and they hire new firefighters as interns every year, and most of our best interns are women. And he says, I find having a mixed gender crew brings down the level of machoism and brings about more cerebral approach to fire that balances hard work and the ultimate goals of improving the ecology on the lands we're working on. So that would be another from I think different ecosystems than Sara worked in and different organization, another example of some of the benefits. And Ivan asks, how much of the current mission and drive towards production, specifically line production, drive our system of incentives? Do you want to comment on that, Sara?
That is a good comment. Thank you, Ivan. I think that our current mission derives almost all of our incentives, right? What we're trying to do, our end goal, is fundamentally the thing that incentivizes who we hire, right? I assume everyone wants to do the best job that they can. Every crew out there wants to meet the mission. And if the mission is put out fires as quickly as possible, as small as possible, right, you're going to hire people that can do that. And I think there's been some questioning of whether or not that mission is the mission that we want to continue into the future. At least I hope that it is. And I believe that women have a really important role in redefining what those incentives are in the future. And I think they could potentially really help direct where our future culture goes. And by doing that, by getting involved with that, hopefully we'll change the incentives such that the playing field is a little bit more fair in terms of the sexes. So good point, Ivan. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, great. That certainly resonates with me. Lisa says, what suggestions do you have for women in the fire natural resource field to combat the male perspective? For example, sexist comments within crew dialogue, especially when trying not to create an argument or potential disagreement among crew members. And that may be sort of outside of your expertise, Sara, but obviously if you have a comment, I think we'd all be interested.
Yeah, isn't that the question of all questions? It's really challenging, right? I can say that I did not do this well when I was 18, 19, 20. And I think that's a challenge that most people face, right? You're in your early stages, you're trying to build a reputation. On top of that, you're a woman, and you just many people don't lack the confidence. I didn't lack the confidence to speak up and say, hey, that's really inappropriate. You should stop talking about that, and here's why. And I wish that I had, but I didn't. I didn't have that confidence. Later in my fire career, I found that I did start to gain that confidence. And there are specific examples that I won't give here, but I'm sure you can all picture those kinds of examples that somebody did say something, and then I felt confident enough to speak up and say, hey, that isn't right. So somehow we need to get those leaders that are in a position of feeling confident, being able to speak up. So our leaders from squad bosses, crew bosses, on up to model this behavior of saying, hey, it's okay to say, that makes me feel uncomfortable. And I think it does need to come from leadership, and I'm not talking senior leadership at the agency level, but I'm talking crew leadership, right? That needs to be modeled. And thinking back about the crews that I felt the most included on, that was the case. Those leaders made it really clear what their intent was, that it's not a place that we should be discussing inappropriate things. If anyone is uncomfortable, they could go and talk to that leader. So having this open dialogue and strong leaders, for lack of a better term, in these sorts of crew-level positions, I see as being one of the ways to combat that challenge.
Here, that makes sense. And maybe it doesn't need to be said, but I'll say it anyway. I think a lot of the responsibility falls on shoulders of other men on crews and in leadership.
Absolutely.
So let's see. Hannah adds, the complexities of managing wildland fire are so challenging. The only way to solve problems related to too much or not enough fire will come from having as diverse a team as possible working on it. I'm so proud that women and men are starting to have these uncomfortable and difficult conversations more openly and publicly. I'm optimistic these conversations will lead to a change on the fire line and will make fire a better and safer career for all. And I think that I think that's a excellent way of saying it. And certainly there are a whole slew of issues, some new research on smoke and smoke effects on firefighters. There are a whole number of reasons why we need to think very carefully about some of the incentives that have been brought up before. So that's a great point. Let's see. Estee adds, if we can figure out how to make fire more accepting of women without forcing them to act more like one of the guys, fire would be a more comfortable place for men to work too. Win-win. Again, here, I agree. Emily Hoff adds, would it be detrimental or helpful to have positions that are specified for women, suited to their strengths that you mentioned in fire careers, in terms of eliminating sexism and barriers to entering the field? I think that's a very interesting suggestion, Emily, and Sara, I don't know if you want to weigh in on that idea, but I think it's around the idea that there are some particular strong suits that women may bring, and maybe carving out particular roles that emphasize those would highlight that.
Yeah, it is. It is interesting, and I really think how it's sort of rolled out, for lack of a better term, would be really important, right? If it came from male leaders and it's sort of supported, I think it could be really interesting, if not highly successful. So, very interesting idea.
If we force firefighters to stop acting and talking like they are in a frat or a locker room, would that jeopardize crew cohesion? That's a very interesting point that I sort of similar comments. What do you think of that, Sarah?
Yeah, I actually sadly agree that a lot of crew cohesion does happen around things that we don't necessarily all condone, but does result in positive cohesion. So I think you're right. And how we sort of change that or alter that or slowly grow to a place where other ways of including crew cohesion, other ways of building that, I'm not sure, but I think that's one of the things that we need to work on incentivizing. So here yet again.
Yeah, and certainly there are plenty of other ways to build cohesion than that sort of frat or locker room atmosphere. Emily Huff adds, do you feel that any of the current programs in the agency, or that the agency offers, for instance, Women in Wildland Fire Series, is helping to change the culture, or should the agency take a different approach? And I might add to that list things like the, maybe I guess it's not Forest Service, but it's another example of programs, the women-focused treks, or maybe it's a women-only treks, the Prescribed Fire Training Exchange.
Yeah, I can't help but think that they do help and that they have helped. For women of sort of my era that were brought on, there were not women-specific opportunities necessarily, or none that I participated in, and many of my peers of sort of my, kind of 90s to mid-2000s, most of the people that I worked with closely and know best personally didn't have those opportunities. So I can't speak to sort of the newer generation of firefighters and their feelings. It would be very interesting to find out from that group. Most of my sort of generation, I feel, sort of did make it on their own without many programs like this, and so I would like to think that they have been very successful. I don't know if that's the case definitively.
Great. Let's see. Bree adds a good comment. I guess I should, before I dive into some more comments, I should recognize we're a little bit over time. I recognize some people will have to drop off. Sarah, thank you for sticking with us, and I think we'll try to wind down here, but it's been such a good conversation, and I want to make sure we sort of recognize some of these other comments.
Yeah.
So Bree says, I would absolutely support my daughter getting into fire. It's an incredible profession with an uncomparable camaraderie. Each person, male or female, must prove themselves in this job, and it is a positive character builder. Women in this field are few, which means there's room for more. That's a great point. And Rick adds, I met with the women in my program 2 years ago and heard many of your comments, assumptions from them. I also heard that differences in leadership styles was challenging between genders, but maybe was more related to being a leader than gender in some cases. So I think that's a useful point, Rick, and I think there are other. We're sort of honing in on one aspect here today, but obviously there are a lot of conflated issues. Another one that we should acknowledge is that folks from other ethnicities or other races are not well represented in natural resources or fire, and they bring other perspectives and benefits to a team. So it's another kind of piece of this whole puzzle. Let's see, Krista, she asks, do men have to give up qualities that might be perceived as feminine to be on the fire line? I don't know, Sarah, comment on that. I'm sure there are other male firefighters on the list here who could also add to that.
I would say not universally, but I would say that it takes a very strong individual to get over the initial hazing, and I do use that word in its traditional sense, that occurs for men who have a more feminine way of being. I worked with a gentleman who I would say did have sort of those characteristics as being perceived as more feminine. And for years, people behind his back asked, man, do you think he's going to quit? And he never did. And am I ever grateful that he did not? Because in the end, and it was about that 7 or 8 years of fire, knowing him, he became someone who is incredibly well respected. He did not change his persona. He somehow was strong enough to make it through. And I think through eventually gaining some support of peers, doing a really good job, sort of doing that proving that Bree mentioned in her comments. And we are definitely a stronger organization because of that individual and certainly other individuals like him, but he had to go through a lot. And that should be acknowledged and definitely not condoning what he had to go through. So that was a long-winded answer to Krista's question.
Yeah, no, but it resonates. Sherry adds that in brainstorming solutions and benefits, there's a danger of stereotyping women. Not all women have the traits you mentioned, and I think the last set of comments about men who might bring more feminine traits, I think that's a great point. And yeah, we're really, I think the conversation is about bringing in a range of perspectives, and different people might bring those, male or female. So thanks for sharing that. Oh, and Heather says that the women's treks accepts men too. There are about 5 in the last class, so thank you for correcting me there. And the women's treks are designated as 90% men, or 90% women, 10% men, as a reversal of the typical crew. Having both perspectives has been critical. Great, thank you. Drag Sharp says, Sarah, thank you for your courage and for doing the research and sharing your truth. As an African American with 27 years in fire management, oops, I scrolled too far, I'm struggling with a question postponed for fodder and discussion. I think primarily because the challenge is for everyone to assimilate into our culture and the divisiveness going on in our country right now. I would have to identify crews, modules, etc. that are providing leadership when it comes to combating these things, and would allow anyone that I think that would support to be safe. I think your research and ideologies related to our behavior associated with women could apply to many minorities as well. We have a long way to go. Thank you for taking huge steps forwards and making steps towards making things right. So thank you. Maybe that's a good comment to end on. I'll also save this chat window because I think there are a lot of good comments, and I did a very poor job reading them, but trying to get them out quickly. So Sarah, thank you again so much for an excellent presentation and really getting this good conversation going. And if there are folks in the audience who are doing similar research or have other things I think could be useful in sharing in this sort of format, a webinar format, I think certainly the Southwest Fire Science Consortium would be interested in hosting future conversations. We can also do other things like panels. Perhaps we should have a panel just on the women's treks. But definitely get in touch with me or Barb and let us know if you have ideas. And Sarah, I'll turn it to you for any last comments.
No, just thank you very much for all the excellent comments and questions, and of course for listening and for receiving this so well. I really appreciate the opportunity, and a big thanks to Xander for doing a great job facilitating and leading and setting this up. So thank you all. I look forward to talking with you hopefully in the future.
Great. Thank you again, everybody. I'm going to close down the webinar now.